who had the best Thanksgiving? Nobody? Everybody's Thanksgiving sucked. Too much Reddit in Thanksgiving. Well, maybe you'll be like twice as productive with your life now that you're not distracted by Reddit. Anybody, let's see, anybody have a Thanksgiving meal that was more interesting than just turkey?
Barbecue tri-tip.
Barbecued what?
Tri-tip.
Tri-tip, oh. Is that like a tradition for your household? Or
do something.
Just something new?
We all cannot stand for we get like completely different.
Okay, cool.
We had a Thanksgiving salmon.
Ah, Thanksgiving. You're like Washington? Is it
Portland.
Portland? Okay. Makes sense. Just think of fish up there or salmon up there. So I guess I don't really think of fish there. I think of fish in Alaska, salmon in Alaska, and had some friends who lived in Alaska for a little while from being in the Coast Guard, and visited them and just saw salmon everywhere. And I just knew you weren't from Alaska, so that was the closest place to Alaska. Anybody else do anything more interesting than turkey? Yeah, sure. Indian pizza? Is that like a Thanksgiving thing for you, or just a, right? What about like, is Indian pizza a thing that you do regularly, or is that just a one-time thing?
Will it be a repeat? Yes.
Yeah. I love pizza. I love Indian food. So, one of the things that I've always wanted, but I've never done, is getting like one of those actual like pizza ovens in our backyard that gets the temperature up to like 2,000 degrees, yeah, so that you can cook the pizza in just a minute like you're supposed to.
You're supposed to only cook it for a minute?
Well, if you have a hot enough pizza oven, that's all it takes to cook it. That's one of our favorite activities with our 3-year-old toddler is we'll make pizza from scratch, and he likes playing with the Play-Doh and trying to make things out of it. But then after we eat it, after it's cooked, he always refuses to eat it. He only actually eat frozen pizza. Doesn't like it from delivered from anywhere. Doesn't like it made from scratch. Only likes frozen pizza. And only if it has.
Yeah.
Yep. Oh yeah. So yeah, welcome everybody to our official start of CS40 post Thanksgiving. Hope you all had good, restful Thanksgiving breaks. We have, so as a reminder about just what's left in store for us in this class, we have a total of about 300 points in the class, and there's about like 70, 80 points remaining. And so you have about a quarter of your grade left. Your homework 4 has been graded and uploaded in Sakai. Overall, the grades were pretty good. I was pleased with them. So the median grade was 29 out of 30, 18 students with grades above 30, and then 3 students with grades that were around 40 out of 30. So one of the most common ways for people to miss points was on task 3. About 1 out of 3 students had a serious problem with your task 3 implementation. And so that task 3 was the one where it was trying to figure out, make sure that you're not replying to the same comment twice. And the way I graded this was I just opened up everybody's codes and looked at it and saw if I could see a mistake in there. And so it's possible if you did something clever, I might have made a mistake on doing that. So if you would like to ask questions about why I think it's wrong or say that you think it's right, then feel free to let me know about that, and I'll reconsider the grade. In general, for all of your submissions, if you said that you thought you got some points and I disagreed, I wrote an explanation about why in Sakai, so you can take a look at that. But if you were, if I agreed with all the things that you said, then I just gave you all the points. One of the tasks I think that was so deceptively hard was getting the 1,000 valid comments task. I noticed this morning that there was a lot of GitHub chat about that. Apologize I wasn't more on top of that over Thanksgiving. But yeah, so only four students got this particular extra credit. And in particular, a lot of students mentioned in your README that something to the effect of you thought you would have gotten it if the BotTown sub wasn't banned. And all the students who mentioned that, I disagree with your assessment. So that's another one of the things that if you disagree with my disagreement, then let me know and we'll talk about your particular case in detail. But the summary is that Reddit only lets you look at the past 1,000 most recent comments. And because of that, in order to get 1,000 valid comments, every single one of those past 1,000 comments must be valid. And if for whatever reason you have a invalid comment somewhere in there, you have to post 1,000 new valid comments in order to get those invalid comments out of that list and have them all be valid. So because of that, it's just a particularly hard thing to debug, and you have to let your code run for a long time. So that's why it's maybe harder than it looked, that particular extra credit. A lot of students did the upvoting and downvoting extra credit, and the Markovify GPT-3 extra credit. Just comments about that, or if those ideas of like automating the sentiment analysis and upvoting, downvoting of things, if you want to understand in more detail how that like actually works under the hood, and in particular the text blob library, it's about like 15 years out of date from state of the art. So a lot of people pointed out that there were like, it's actually not very good, and that's true. There are a lot of better techniques out there. They're just harder to use, so that's why I didn't suggest them for you. But if you go on to take the data mining course, then that's one of the things that we cover in extensive detail is sort of state-of-the-art techniques for that sentiment analysis. And the application is knowing when to, maybe a bad application is knowing when to upvote and downvote things. There are better, more useful applications than that. So maybe a positive application is that Amazon, on all the Amazon reviews, they automatically do a sentiment analysis check just to make sure that your like star ratings sort of agrees with the text of your post and you didn't make a mistake with those star ratings. And then similarly for the actual text generation, that's one of the things that we'll talk in detail about in the data mining class. So if those things are interesting to you, then the data mining class is the thing to go for. The overall class average is staying about a 93%, but again, we have about a quarter of the points sort of remaining in the class, and so yeah, just remember that. And I guess another point, last point grade-wise, is a handful of students posted about the required reading viewing on GitHub, and don't forget about that. Don't put it off. That things are only going to get busier as finals week comes. So try to, my recommendation is trying to complete that as early as possible, but you do have till the end of finals week to complete that if you need to. Any questions about anything grading wise?
If we have a specific one.
If you have a specific, like, about my problem, then we can talk about that one-on-one after class. So real quick about the bot town subreddit being banned. My first comment about that is sorry that I think that, let's see, I think it added maybe a little bit more work to people, but I think overall people were overestimating the amount of extra work that might have added for them. That's, yeah. I remember people asked for extensions. I don't think an extension was warranted because I don't think my assessment of the amount of extra work was about like 5 to 10 minutes of extra work that would add. But in many ways, this is actually a good thing because it introduces you to this idea of like just weird things always happening on these sorts of real problems. And if you're on the sort of data science or computer science track wanting to do internships this coming summer or future summers, this is the sort of thing that most people applying for internships don't have any sort of stories like this that they can talk about, stories of real world problems that they've encountered in their internships, interviews. But you would have this sort of story that you can talk about how you were writing this Reddit bot and Reddit misbehaved on you and what you had to do to overcome it. And that's the sort of challenge that you're going to encounter in any real world situation. And so people like hearing those stories in internship interviews. And then the last thing, the main takeaway from this assignment, if you don't take away anything else, then just knowing that like bots are maybe not trivial to create, but they're not super hard to create. And so most, and then depending on how you define most, but definitely fair to say that a lot of online activity is done by bots. This comment about on the internet, nobody knows you're a dog. There's this famous cartoon from the New Yorker right here in 1993 of on the internet, nobody knows you're a dog. So you shouldn't be like actually assuming that anybody you're interacting with on the internet is a human. One of the last comment about bots is sort of one of the most insidious type of bots that exist. Now that you've done a little bit of this working with bots. But one of the really popular bots that's, and this is definitely like in the hardcore evil side of bots, is that when people, so back in the day, so like in the 1990s, when people hacked your computer, took over your computer, they would, just for the lulz, like delete everything on your computer. They don't really do that anymore now. Instead, on that same vein, they might encrypt everything on your computer and charge you money to get the encryption key back. That's a popular thing. But another popular thing, which it's not really talked about outside of the computer science world, is people will just have bots running on your computer that every time you log into Facebook, it will randomly click, maybe not randomly, but it will click on like and unliking things for you based on what other people are paying the bot's owners to have liked or not liked. And so if you were running a political campaign and you needed, say, 1,000 likes from California to get your story to go viral in California, you don't want obvious bots doing it. So you have these people who have taken over all of your computers and post those likes and post messages from your actual accounts. Because Facebook's not going to ban actual accounts, even if they are posting and doing bot sort of activities. Any questions about anything Reddit or bot related before we move on?
Yeah. What would you say is like the most effective way for running Facebook if they wanted to like, get rid of bots?
Yeah, so what's the most effective way for actually getting rid of these bots. So again, that's something that we'll cover in detail in the data mining class about the techniques that are being used. At a high level, it boils down to sort of looking for patterns of we've identified that this type of activity is, usually they don't talk about like bot versus not bot activity, except like publicly, internally, and in the computer science world, they talk more about like healthy versus unhealthy activity, because there are people who do bad things and there are bots who do good things. And so you really want to identify the healthy versus not healthy activity. And it's all down to, you have humans manually deciding what is healthy activity, and then machine learning algorithms sort of generalize that to other cases. One of the, let's see, yeah, Facebook has been sort of under attack for having lots of these sort of like bot unhealthy activities. Facebook doesn't have like a bot API like Reddit does, but really Reddit's API is just a wrapper around that requests library, visiting the right web pages. So it's not too much more work to like build your own API. The real company though that is sort of most infamous right now for doing a really bad job at tracking down this sort of unhealthy behavior is Amazon, with a lot of fake reviews on different products and fake product listings. And Amazon has no like financial incentive at this point to get rid of those things. So even like the most stupid, simple algorithms would totally clean up Amazon by orders of magnitude, and Amazon doesn't do that because they would lose money.
How do you mean lose money?
So a lot of people go to Amazon and purchase products based on the reviews, and so the fact that there's lots of good reviews for a product on Amazon makes people want to purchase it, even if the product's like counterfeit or something.
Yeah.
Very well could have been. Wasn't aware of that. GitHub is, yeah, the whole programming world, maybe not the whole, but half the programming world comes to a screeching halt when GitHub is down, because everybody relies on it. Okay, so then we have 4 more class periods. The remainder of our class periods, we're going to be doing sort of the opposite end again. Instead of writing programs that interact with other people's web pages, we're going to be building those other web pages. In last class period, we started talking about this with this Sql programming language. And so we're going to start off today doing a little bit of just review of Sql and why we care about Sql. And then as a reminder, you have a quiz on Wednesday on the different Sql commands. And so we'll just, again, review the format of that quiz because it's been a while. And then we'll be talking about how this Sql stuff forms the backbone of a typical web application. So our goal, what we're working towards, is building what's called a CRUD app. And this is actually the technical term. You'll hear people talking about CRUD apps all the time, and everybody knows exactly what it means. And it means a web page that's backed by a SQL database. And most of the interactive web pages on the internet, so like Facebook or Twitter or Reddit, are these CRUD applications. CRUD stands for create, read, update, and destroy, corresponding to these 4 Sql commands right here. And the idea is that all of the information on Facebook or Twitter, it's just sort of a wrapper around these Sql commands. That when you post a new message on Reddit, when your bots were doing that, internally Reddit was just calling this insert Sql command in the right way. And when you were deleting messages, it was just calling this delete Sql command in the right way. And so we'll be writing our own clone of Twitter in this case that will be wrapping around SQL to do this. And so one of the great questions that people had last time that we didn't really talk about much is like, why do we actually care about SQL? That we already know some ways of storing information and accessing that information. And in particular, we call these, so things like JSON or CSV, it's common to call them flat files. Anything that is not a SQL database file, we would call a flat file. The reason for this term flat is that SQL databases have a lot of internal structure to them that lets things happen fast. And then if you go on to take the big data course or the data structures course, we talk a lot of detail about how that works, how it becomes fast, and why that's different from these flat files. But at this point, it's just, if you hear somebody talk about flat files, that means anything besides SQL.
Would it be more efficient? I think, like, that is faster efficiency.
SQL is faster and more efficient. There are lots of ways that things can be more efficient. In the data structures class, the follow-on to this, that's really the focus of the class, is sort of understanding what are the different ways that things can be more efficient. One is, like you just pointed out, Natalie, is that you can be faster. And SQL code is guaranteed to be much faster than equivalent Python code. So the technical term is that it's asymptotically faster or asymptotically optimal. And but even just like with runtime efficiency, there's also this idea of memory efficiency. That if you had, say, like a data set of billions of data points, so too much data to fit in the memory of an individual computer, SQL can automatically distribute that across many different computers for you and efficiently access it from those different computers. So we're not going into those sorts of details in this class. But again, that's like the underlying motivation for why we're starting to talk about SQL, so that we can go into those details later on. Another way of thinking about efficiency is like programmer efficiency. So like, how much typing do I as a programmer have to do to accomplish a certain task? And these days, that's usually what companies care about for efficiency, because programmers are expensive. So we saw that levels.fyi website, a new grad, very first day at Google is making $200,000 a year, and somebody with more experience is going to be making up to 7 figures is not uncommon in the tens of millions per year. And because of that, like, you can buy a lot of computers for $10 million when it costs one senior Google engineer to pay per year. And so Google doesn't care like how much computing resources they have to throw at a problem. They care about how many programmers they have to throw at a problem. And SQL, once you get used to it, is much, much more efficient from a programming perspective than Python. It takes a lot of getting used to it. So that's why we're sort of, in our data science program, spreading it out over many, many different courses here, so you have a lot of exposure to it. But that's the basic idea. Eventually, you'll see how hundreds of lines of really complex Python can all be reduced down to one like single line of SQL. And SQL also provides something called ACID guarantees. You'll see this term thrown around a lot when people are talking about SQL. But the basic idea is that when data is written to the database, it's guaranteed to actually be in the database, and even under catastrophic hardware failure. So one of my favorite things to do in our data science program, and the thing that I hated most about coronavirus was I couldn't do this last year, but in the big data class, I'll have a laptop, and somebody will take a sledgehammer and smash the laptop, and then we will recover the data from the laptop because it was stored in the SQL database. You can't do things like that with JSON and CSV data, but you can with SQL data. So yeah, all the details of all these things don't have to make sense at this point, but hopefully this should at least give you some motivation about like why people might care about this. And so in this class, we're using sort of connecting SQL to Python and seeing how to interact with it. In the subsequent classes, we'll be going into the details about all of these things. At super high level about the motivation for SQL, but any questions about any of that? Question?
I'm curious about two things. What is, first of all, what is the definition of asymmetric optical?
Yeah, so the question is, what exactly is the definition of this asymptotically optimal? And it takes about a month in the data structures class to really like formally define it. It ends up being a calculus style math equation, and so it's
what else acid stand for? Acid guarantees.
oh, ACID. So it's an acronym for 4 different things. It stands for atomic consistent, idempotent, and I forget what the D is. But basically, it means you can smash the computer with a sledgehammer and the data's still there. So still there actually in the file. Yeah, again, like what exactly does that mean? It takes the big data course to go through it. It's just a really good thing that means your data is actually going to be there and going to exist. And so companies that care about their data, they want their data to exist, and so they always put things in SQL databases.
Well, on the bottom, you mentioned that the downside was that it makes what pages won't have. Why is that?
Yeah, and then there's this thing called Sql Injection, which we probably won't talk about today, but either Wednesday or maybe Monday next week, we'll see an example of this. And this is, let's see, we've talked about a lot of sort of like hacking things from the computer science perspective of hacking, about like, to somebody at Facebook, hacking means building something cool. But Sql Injection is sort of like the hacking in the sense of actually breaking into stuff. And so we'll see how that works and see how you can defend against this. And this is probably the most, like the #1 hacking technique that's been used historically to break into websites. And so we'll teach you how to do it with the intention of teaching you how to prevent other people from doing it to you. Great questions. I think at this point, we should talk about, let's just review real quickly what SQL is. And so on the week 11 folder, there's these 2 files right here, the practice quiz problems and the practice quiz schema. And these problems are going to, again, be the framework for your quiz that will happen this coming Wednesday. And the way to review SQL and make sure that you understand what all the SQL commands do is to use the sqlfiddle.com website. And so this is sort of like Python Tutor, but for SQL. SQL is this totally separate programming language from Python. And today we'll talk about actually using SQL from within Python. But when preparing for the quiz or just trying to understand like what exactly is SQL, it's easier to do that all by itself, not related to Python, and this is the website that will help you do that. On these files, again, this practice quiz schema.sql, if you click this over here is the contents of what I put in the left-hand box over here. And then the practice quiz, where did it go? Back. Practice quiz _ problems. These are what the actual problems are going to look like on the quiz. And I'll have 5 of these, 5 sort of similar problems selected out, and you'll just have to write the output of these commands on the quiz. And for each of these commands, the way that you can just test your understanding is you copy and paste it into this right-hand box over here. And actually copy it. press the Run SQL button. And then whatever is the output down here is the thing that you're supposed to put in, put for the quiz. And last time, we talked about 4 out of the 5 SQL commands that you're expected to know. Again, on this week 11 folder, there's this list of these 5 commands right here. Create, insert, select, and delete are the 4 commands that we talked about last time. And the one that we have left is this update command. And if we look at our practice problems, the practice problems.
What's the if I'm following along on fiddle.com, wasn't there a thing where it was like you need to change the like MySQL 5 to?
Yes, up here in the top left, there's what we call different dialects of SQL. Each one of these dialects corresponds to just slightly different software that is processing and interpreting these SQL commands. One way to think about it is like, say, the difference between Python 3.5 and Python 2.8 or whatever, that they're basically the same thing, but just some minor differences. In this class, we're using the Sqlite program, which is, the reason we're using it is 1 is it's the easiest to use, and 2 is that it is the most popular software ever written in the entire world. That everybody's, say, cell phone probably has at least 100 versions of Sqlite running on it, that all of the different applications that you have, they all store their information in Sqlite. These other ones, like MySQL and Postgres, these are things that you'll be exposed to exactly what their differences are between them and Sqlite in subsequent classes. But Sqlite is the one you want for this class. And Sqlite with the sql.js is the one in particular that I'm using for this web interface.
I actually had to use the web one. Would it make a difference?
Yeah, good question. There should be no difference between web SQL and sql.js. That they're both Sqlite. Technically, yeah. So technically, what's the difference? Sqlite is written in a programming language called C. C is a particularly efficient programming language, and since Sqlite is so widely used, it's written in this efficient programming language. In order to get it to work on the web page, somehow they had to convert this C language program into something that runs on a web page, so like JavaScript runs on web pages. And there's 2 different processes for doing that conversion. Web SQL is one of them, sql.js is a different one. Depending on your particular computer settings, one might be slightly faster than the other, but but they should give you the same exact results. So there's no, from like an end user's perspective, there should be no difference between them. Good question. Any other questions just about the setup of the quiz or what to expect before we see more SQL specific things?
That's the select ID from users is the first problem.
Yeah, so I just copied and pasted this from the first problem in the SQL problems.sql file. Okay, so here we go. The last command for us to talk about is this update command at the very end. And we'll do this by just copying and pasting this command over here. And so again, the delete commands was sort of formatted in the same way, where there's actually 2 commands listed over here. The semicolon is what actually separates one command from another in SQL. And so this command right here is actually doing the change. And this command right here is displaying the results of the change. So these problems that use the update or the delete commands, they're a little bit more complicated because you have to understand both what this is doing and then what this is doing here to access the data. So I'm going to start by commenting out this first line right here. So in SQL, the way to make a comment is this double dash, which is different than Python, which uses the hashtag. And so we're just going to see what is the output of this select statement. And let's see, sometimes this was giving me errors last time. That's annoying. We'll just start with that. There we go. So none of the SQL commands have any typos or errors in them. This SQL Fiddle website is just a little bit more finicky than the Python tutor, giving random error messages at times. I'm not sure why. But so if we do select star from messages, this gives us the total, like everything that's in the messages table. There's 9 things that have been inserted. And then this update command is what lets us change things. So we're updating the users table, and we're setting the username equal to this right here. The where clause is not required. And so if I were to run this right now, it's going to, oh, what are you doing? Maybe we'll just try this web SQL, see if you want to behave better. Not available in my browser. That's why I chose SQL. Okay, well, this is maybe I'll real quick describe what it's supposed to do, and then we'll see the alternative of actually running this on your computer to run this ourselves. But up here we have the update user set username equals @real_Donald_Trump. This is going to apply to every user in this users table right here. So it's let's change this so it actually displays my users. So we have these usernames down here, and doing this is going to make the username change to real_Donald_Trump for all of these. Because there is no where clause. If I wanted the Trump username right here to actually be the only one that changes to @real_Donald_Trump, then I have to say something like where ID equals 1. If I have the ID, that'll select this row right here, and so only that one will change. And now we have @real_Donald_Trump, or I could say where username equals Trump, run that, and that also changed this right here. One of the things to remember about using this particular interface to Sqlite is that whatever changes we make in this right-hand side, these changes are what we call ephemeral or temporary, or they're not persistent. So I made this update right here. If I were to take away this update command and only do this select command, then we would get back to the original Trump right here, because there's no modifications happening right here. So in all of the problems in the quiz, you should consider each problem like totally independent from each other. If one problem changes something in the database, you should not keep that change around when you go to the next problem, because when you type in the next problem here, it's going to forget any changes that you've made. Anything that's not over here is going to be forgotten, and it'll just only do what's over here based on what's on the left. It was a little bit convoluted because of the website misbehaving. But are there any questions about that, Miles?
I have two questions. So one, so you're saying that like you update the users to set username, like at Donald Trump, and you don't specify which user, it changes all of them, or just changes none of them?
Exactly. So when you have an update and then a set, and there's no where clause, it will change everything. So this here, I have username, but it could be, say, like, it can be any of these columns. We can make all the ages be 55. Run that, and now everybody's age down here is 55. So it's this update command is a little bit dangerous in the same way that that delete command was, because if you forget the where clause, then everything in your database is changing. And once you make that change, there's no way to undo it.
And if you broke your computer right now, would I have 55 or would I have the original ages?
So based on the way that SQL Fiddle is set up, these changes are never like saved. So it's never going to have this. If we comment this out again and do select star from users, all these ages are going to go back. But yeah, if we were, if I had billions of users on my Twitter website and I wanted to change all of their ages at once, then it would guarantee that either all of the ages get changed or none of the ages get changed if the computer breaks halfway through the process.
On problem found on the paper, you do select ID. It's not the same as I don't think it's the same as the one. Instead of like select in front of the select count, you put select ID. It returns ID.
Oh yeah. On the paper, there were two typos. So I think I had something like select count star from messages, or was it users?
Messages.
Okay. And if we run that, this ID over here is it was a typo. You're not. So if you recall, this count is called an aggregate function that before, if we had something like star, the star gets replaced with all of the columns. So we run that, and so we get all of the different columns. When we do count star, that counts all of the columns rather than actually giving me the results of all of the columns. And so there are 9, so it counts the number of rows. There are 9 rows in this table. It's this ID comma is was a typo that this ID, the thing that can get returned by ID is technically allowed to be any number at all. And so it's intended just to be count star. And if you have one of these, if you have a count star, it's only going to be count star on the quiz, not with like an ID comma. Good questions. Any other questions about anything related to the quiz? Eddie.
Since the temporary, the offer from at least from the SQL field, the temporary, then is it actually possible to actually change the data?
In SQL Fiddle, it's not possible to actually change this stuff over here. Yep. So that's a good segue into what we're talking about next. Now that we've talked about just like the SQL commands by themselves, we're going to be working with SQL and Python together. And when you run the SQL commands from within Python, like the insert or the update or the delete commands, they will actually affect the database and make the changes. So on the week 13 folder, I have a couple of Python files that we'll be going over today. These two right here, there's dbaccess.py and dbcreate.py. So you can go ahead and download those while I pull up my VS Code over here. And at a high level, the idea of these two files is they are going to be really useful for us while we're debugging our Twitter project. That what we're going to talk about next, after we talk about the SQL stuff, is how to actually like make a Python program where other people can connect to the Python program through Firefox. There's a lot of complications involved with that. And so these files here will give us just a direct access to our database that we can look at. And the DB create, what it does is it creates a database that's exactly identical to the database from that quiz in the SQL Fiddle on the left-hand side over here. It creates the table users, inserts all of these different users, creates a table messages, and inserts these different messages. And in order to do this in Python, it's pretty straightforward. That this Sqlite3 library is built into Python, so you don't need to pip install it. And then I have some code over here that gives us parses command line arguments. The particular command line argument that we're using is the name of the file that's going to store our database. With JSON files and CSV files, there's a customary file extension or ending after the dot that people use for those files. For SQLite files, there's no customary thing. Sometimes people use .db, sometimes people use .sql or .sql3 or .database. There's no customary file extension for SQL things. And so I don't like typing, so I will be using the DB since it's the shortest in this class. But eventually, if you keep going on, you'll see people using all of these others as well. These two lines right here, lines 16 and 17, are what can connect your program to a particular database file. So sqlite3.connect, and then the name of the file goes in parentheses right here. And again, the name of the file is just, in this case, going to be twitterclone.db as a default file name, unless I pass in something special. This con variable, con stands for connection. And there's always in every program that uses SQL, one of these variables created. And it's just going to be like just one of these variables for the whole file. It's almost always called con. Sometimes people use two ins like this, just because connection is too hard to type out. Cur right here stands for cursor. And the vast majority of the SQL commands that we're going to use are going to happen to this cur variable instead of to the connection variable. Technically, what this cursor is doing is it allows you to run multiple commands at the same time on the same connection. But in this class, we don't need to worry about that. We just know that after you make your connection, you always make a cursor, and then you're just going to have one cursor. In this class, one cur for the whole file. And these are what I would call boilerplate, just because they every file that's using SQL has to have these at the top. So this is our SQLite boilerplate. Then when we want to actually run a SQL command, you create a variable. I usually call it SQL, just, but it's not required. And that variable is a string that contains whatever your SQL command is supposed to be. So here, this create table users corresponds, it's just copied and pasted exactly from this create table users up here. Exactly the same, no difference at all. And whenever you're actually creating the SQL commands themselves, the SQL commands, that you're putting in Python will always be exactly the same as the SQL commands that you would have put in SQL Fiddle. You just put them inside of a string. If you were to forget the string, something like this, then you'll get all sorts of error messages because Python will try to run this as Python code, but it's not Python code, so it needs to be inside of a string. This cursor.execute command, this will actually take this string and pass it over to the SQL database. Internally, the SQL Fiddle website is implemented in Python, and so everything that you type into SQL Fiddle gets put into one of these cursor.execute commands and just passed directly to SQL that way. So
The SQL Fiddle database?
the website, the sqlfiddle.com. So every time I create one of these SQL variables, it's like 99% of the time I'll have cur.execute SQL immediately afterwards. Question?
Yeah, this might kind of be a dumb question, but if you're doing Python and SQL in the same thing, how does your code tell the difference between commenting out versus SQL equals? Is it just because you set it as the SQL equals?
Yeah, the question, it's a great question, is how exactly does our code know that this is SQL here and not something else, like a comment or like a random HTML string or something like that? And the answer is that our code doesn't know, that this could be whatever we want. And one of the things that you'll notice is that VS Code is not able to do any special syntax highlighting for your SQL commands because they're inside of a string inside of Python. And VS Code does not know that this is SQL right here. The only way that this is identified as SQL is when we actually pass it to this execute command. When we do this, then whatever was contained in this string will be evaluated by the Sqlite program. And if it's not valid SQL, then it will give an error message saying it's not valid SQL. But yeah, at this point, up until line 28, Python has no way of knowing that this stuff inside of here is actual SQL code. It's only line 29 that actually connects the Python to the SQL. This last line right here of connection.commit, this is what actually says save the changes that I just made to the database. On the SQL Fiddle executes up to here, but does not run the connection.commit on the right-hand side. And that's why those, whatever changes you made, whatever inserts or updates you do, they don't actually update whatever's internally happening in the database. So it's never wrong to add a connection.commit if you don't need it, but you always will want to have a connection.commit after any time you do something that changes the database, like creating tables, inserting, updating, deleting. The next part of this code has a bunch of, so those insert statements, just one after the other. And each one of these has its own different cursor.execute. In this case, I did not create a separate variable for each one of these different SQL statements. They're just inside of strings, and those strings are getting passed to the cursor.execute. That it's the cursor.execute that's actually cares about processing this as SQL and connecting it to the SQL database. And then again, doing the commit at the end to say, save the changes that we've just made. Question, Eddie?
Yes. Question. Is the 3 dot quotation necessary?
Good question. So the question is here, so up here I'm using the 3 quotation marks like this, and that's necessary for a multi-line string. If I had single quotes like this is not valid Python, because in Python, in order for a string to span multiple lines, it must have the triple quotes. Could be triple double quotes, that would be okay as well, or triple single quotes, doesn't matter. But then down here we have this we have the triple quotes right here without a multi-line. And the question is, do we need these triple quotes? And the answer is kind of, sort of. There are other things that we could do, but there's a problem with doing the individual quotes. And the problem is that in my SQL down here, I'm using individual quotes inside of the SQL statement. And so if I use the individual quotes for the Python, then Python will get confused, not knowing that trump here should still be inside of the string. So somehow I have to use anything other than single quotes. I could use double quotes, and that will work fine as well. In this case, I just happened to pick the triple quotes instead of the double quotes. Either of those would be exactly the same, though. Great question. Any other questions so far?
Sorry, could you remind me what the cure.execute does?
So in the cure.execute, this is anytime you have a SQL command, whatever that SQL command is, it must go to cur.execute in order for that command to get processed. So here we have this insert command, and by passing it into this cur.execute, it actually runs this command and puts that into the database. These execute commands and this commit command are very closely related, that this is like this actually save the changes that you've made, and these are this is make the change, this is save the change.
So this basically decides the schema.
Exactly. So these 6 lines right here correspond exactly to these 6 lines right here from the left-hand side of SQL Fiddle.
And why do we use the cur.execute for creating the rules about?
So up here, we are using the cur.execute right here.
Oh, I see. Okay.
That because this was a multi-line thing, I just put it into its own variable and then pass in the variable. And so usually if I have like a big statement, I might do something like this. But if it's a one-line thing, I might do something like this just to make things a little bit more readable.
And we always use the cun.commit every time we create, or every time we add something to the schema.
So anytime you do an insert, update, delete, anything that changes your database, you want to do the cursor.commit. Yep, good questions. Did
Yes. Why call this these dummy
oh, the question is, why did I call this dummy data? And the answer is because eventually, so we're going to have a website that's built around this, and the website you're going to be able to like insert, like create messages through the website. And so the data that's actually created through the website, I'm thinking of as the real data, and this data that's that I sort of hard-coded here, I'm calling dummy data. It's just a commonly used term for data that you're that's only just to test to see like that the database is working, but it's not real data. So now so we've talked about like the code of this db create file. Let's actually run it and see what happens. If you look over here on the left-hand side, so I'm opened up to my week 13 folder, and you'll see that there's no file that ends in .db. And in particular, there's no Twitter clone.db file. But as soon as I run this, it's going to create that file for us. Python3 db_create, like this. And it happens pretty quick, and you see that this Twitter clone.db file was added over here. one of the downsides of this SQLite format is that because it is not a flat file format, it's in SQL, VS Code can't open it up and look at it for you. You'll get an error message like this if you click on the file name. So if you want to actually look at the contents, the way that I recommend doing this is using the sqlite3 executable on the command line. And exactly how you do this will depend on everybody's system. There was a link that suggested that you download this last class so that you'd be able to do this at this point in this class. But if you do sqlite3 and then the name of a database, so in this case, twitterclone.db like this, it opens it up into an interactive SQL mode. And it's sort of like interactive Python because I can just type SQL commands in here directly. But you know it's SQL because it says SQLite over here. And now if I did something like select star from users, it'll show me all of the information about the users down here in this not super pretty looking table, but table nonetheless. So this is the easiest way to just check that your database contents is actually what you think it should be. And so for that reason, I recommend that you go through that procedure of downloading this program so that you can do this and just easily check to see what is the contents of your database. This will help you when you're debugging on our assignments in this class because this way you'll be able to narrow down, is the problem a SQL problem or is it like a SQL plus Python problem? And then you can exit out of the interactive SQLite by pressing Control-D, just like you would do in the interactive Python. So again, Python 3 dbcreate.py will create the Python file for you, or sorry, will create the database for you. But now if I run this again a second time, you'll see that we'll get this SQLite3 operational error saying the table users already exists. In this twitterclone.db file that we created the first time, the very first time we ran this, we created the table users and then insert stuff into it. We're getting this error message because this table users already exists. And so this line right here, line 29 in Python is the one that's failing. When we get to these error messages that involve SQL and Python, this is going to be probably the hardest part about our upcoming assignment. And so we're going to see lots and lots of examples about this in the next few classes. But how do the error messages that we get, how do they relate to the actual SQL code is a really challenging thing. The reason it's challenging is because in Python, the error happens on line 29 right here. But this is not actually where like the fundamental root of the error is. The root of the error is that I'm trying to run this create table users on a database that already has a table users. And that doesn't make sense to do. And so when we have this error message, at this point, the fundamental principle to take away from this is that whenever you have an error message on a line that says cursor.execute, you should be thinking the error is probably actually in the SQL and not in the Python. So look up at the SQL and try to figure out what's wrong with that SQL. We'll illustrate this again real quickly just by changing this to be some sort of invalid SQL statement. So create table users is a valid SQL statement, but blah, 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 create table users is not a valid SQL statement. And so if I run this, we'll also get this operational error near blah, syntax error. And this again, line 30 in Python in my dbcreate.py, happening on line 30, but the actual error is caused inside of this SQL somewhere up here. So that's just a preview about the challenges that we're going to be encountering with this SQL Python interaction over the next few class days. in order to actually be able to successfully run this file again, there's two things that we can do. One is that we can delete our old Twitter clone, right click over here, delete, move to trash. And now when we run it, everything will work as expected because there was not already a database file. That's one option. The other option is to specify a totally separate database file with this db_file command, db_file, and I'll call it new database.db. And now it's going to operate on this new database.db file. And so you can see over here, there's a new database.db file and a Twitter clone.db file. And so sometimes while we're working on our web page, you might want to have one database that's like, has thousands or millions of comments in it to stress test your code that way, and another database that only has a small number of comments so that everything goes quickly and efficiently. So you can create multiple database files this way with this --db file parameter onto db create. Any questions about that? Okay. Then this next file, db_access.py. This is sort of the opposite of the dbcreate.py. The dbcreate gives you examples of how to use the creating table commands and the insert commands. dbaccess shows examples of using the select commands. If I come down here and type Python3 db_access.py, it'll show me some basic output of like what are the contents of my database. And so here at the top, it starts with the users table, and then it has one of these little sections for all the information about each one of the users. And so ID equals 1, username equals Trump, password I am Trump, age 76. And that's all the information that was directly added in this insert command right over here. So that's what it's doing. And now the question is, how is it doing that? So at the top, again, we always import Sqlite. And then we have our connection and our cursor commands. This is all exactly the same that we had before. Every one of your files is going to have this inside of it. And now down here, we have our SQL statement that says select star from users. So this is the particular SQL command that I want to run. And so every time we have a SQL command, we always follow it by the cursor.execute, passing in the SQL command to the execute command. And now there's this new function called cursor.fetchAll. Cur.fetchAll is gives us access to all of the results. Technically, this is not a list. It's an iterable, and the iterable is something that is list-like that we can do in the for loops like this. But yeah, so we can loop over every row this way. Each one of the entries in cursor.fetchAll is one of these rows. And so for row in cursor.fetchAll, row of 0, row of 1, row of 2, row of 3. Row is like a list. These are the indices into the list, and these indices correspond to these particular values. A good question is, how did I know that like these numbers right here corresponded to these particular columns? Whenever you use the select star from users, the order of the columns that you get back is going to be the order that the columns were created on the insert, on the create table here. So up here, when we did create table, ID, users, password, age. Now, whenever we do select star gives each row as ID, let's see, it was ID, username, password, age, because that's the order in create table. it's very, in practice, most people would say that it's bad practice to do a select star, because maybe sometime in the future, some other person might change the create table command to be in a different row or a different ordering. Turns out there are some reasons why you might prefer one ordering over the other. And so if you actually were to explicitly list the names of the columns, like ID, username, password, age, then it guarantees that they're going to be in this order. So here, guarantees ID will be 0, username 1, password 2, and age 3, no matter what order they were provided in the DB create file. Ellie?
Is that kind of like it's like a key and value, and so like if you do like the numbers and then you change the table, like it would like link different keys to different values, or like incorrect keys to values?
Yep, that's the exact right way to think about it. Yep. So just to reiterate what Natalie was saying, that you can think of these as, so row is technically not a list or a dictionary, but you can think of it as a list where these things right here are the indices, or you can think of it as a dictionary where these things right here are the keys. And when you do row subscripted at one of these indexes, you get the value. That's the exact right way to be thinking about it. Good question. Any other questions at this point? Okay. So this pattern right here is what you're going to want to use in anytime you're doing a select statement in our homework or labs these next 2 weeks. Is you'll have a select something from something. Usually you'll also want to have a where clause. So usually add a where clause. But you'll have some sort of select statement, and then you'll loop over all of the rows. Even if you know for sure that you're only getting back 1 row, or even if you think you might be getting back 0 rows, you still do a for loop over it, and then do whatever processing you want to have down here. So yeah, it's just printing out the contents of the users and the messages table down here. And so if for whatever reason you can't get that Sqlite executable working on your computer, then you can just use this dbaccess.py to actually look at the contents of your table as well. Any questions about anything related to SQL and Python, connecting them together? Okay, we have just a few minutes left in class, and so we're going to do a real quick intro to this library called Flask, which is going to let us turn Python actually into a web server that we can connect to. So we'll spend Wednesday really going onto this in detail, but today just giving you a quick intro to what this is going to do. And so this library is called Flask, and in order to be able to do from Flask import Flask, in order to be able to do this, you'll have to pip install it. It's not something that's built into Python, and there's a lot of annoying boilerplate that you have to do to get Flask to work. I'll have this file uploaded so you can see what I'm going to type a lot of stuff real quick here, and so you don't necessarily have to get it all down, or if you miss something, that's okay. And then This is the simplest possible web page that we can create. And we'll talk about exactly what this is doing here in a little bit. But we can run this with Python 3 and then call this monday.py like this. And when you run one of these Flask programs, Flask is one of these daemons that's going to be running forever until you tell it to stop. So it's helpfully telling you to press Control-C to quit down here. And we want this behavior because this is the actual web server that somebody can connect to interact with your web page. So down here on this last line, it says running on this right here. This might look slightly different for every one of you. But what 127.0.0.1, remember that this is an IP address. And so this is how to find your particular computer. And this is a special IP address that means connect to the current computer that you're actually on. And so if we take this and copy and paste it into Firefox, then we get a message up here saying some hello world. And it says hello world up here because I typed hello world over here. I can add some HTML tags, like we'll make the hello world bold like this, and come down here, Control-C and restart it. And back over here, if I refresh, now we have bold out over here as hello world. And so now we can have not just HTML in our web pages, but we can have Python that has different, say, like if statements and for loops that's generating the HTML for us automatically, connecting to the SQL, and we'll be able to build very dynamic web pages this way. So for next time, again, get the Flask library installed so that you can follow along with what we're doing in class. And we'll be focusing on this and then combining this together with SQL and HTML and everything else to make Twitter.
If it says command is not found when I do pip install Flask.
There's for every computer, it'll be different on how to do the pip install. And so however you installed like YouTube download and all the other libraries, you'll have to relook that up and do that sort of system. Mouse.
What was the purpose of the ampersand app.root, the backslash?
Yeah, good question. The question is, what exactly is the purpose of this? And at this point, we haven't talked about that. We'll talk about that next time. This is just a minimal working example to see that you can connect now to Python inside of Firefox. So great question. Hold on to it for next time. And again, reminder for next time, make sure to do the, or we'll have that SQL quiz, so make sure to be prepared for that. If anybody has any other questions about anything we covered today, happy to